The morning of December 7th, 1941, dawned clear and peaceful over the Hawaiian island of Oahu. At Pearl Harbor, the massive naval base that served as the crown jewel of America's Pacific Fleet, sailors were enjoying their Sunday morning routine. Some attended church services, others wrote letters home, and many simply savored the rare luxury of sleeping in after a week of rigorous training and maintenance duties. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the bridge of his flagship, gazing out at the impressive array of American naval power spread before him. 8 mighty battleships rested at anchor in what was known as Battleship Row, their steel hulls gleaming in the morning sun. The USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS Pennsylvania represented the backbone of American naval might in the Pacific. Nearby, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels dotted the harbor like a forest of steel and brass. The admiral had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss on this tranquil Sunday morning. Intelligence reports had been flowing in about Japanese movements in the Pacific, but most military analysts believed any potential attack would come thousands of miles away in the Philippines or perhaps the Dutch East Indies. Pearl Harbor, nestled deep in the heart of the Pacific Ocean and surrounded by the natural barriers of the Hawaiian Islands, seemed invulnerable to assault. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, a different scene was unfolding. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, led by the flagship Akagi under the command of Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, cut through the Pacific swells with deadly purpose. This was Kido Butai, the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku carried a total of 408 aircraft, all meticulously prepared for what would become one of the most devastating surprise attacks in military history. The Japanese plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was audacious in its scope and timing. Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, understood American industrial capacity better than most of his contemporaries. He knew that Japan's only hope of victory lay in delivering a crippling blow that would keep the United States Pacific Fleet out of action for at least 6 months, buying precious time for Japanese forces to consolidate their conquests across the Pacific. Back at Pearl Harbor, the morning ritual continued undisturbed. Mess halls filled with the aroma of bacon and coffee as sailors lined up for breakfast. Officers reviewed duty rosters and maintenance schedules, planning another routine day of training exercises and equipment checks. The harbor's defensive measures were operating at their normal peacetime levels, with radar stations manned, but not at full alert status. At Opana Point, 2 Army radar operators, Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, were monitoring their equipment as part of their regular morning watch. The Opana radar station, one of several scattered across Oahu, was designed to detect incoming aircraft, but the technology was still relatively new, and the operators were still learning to interpret the green blips that appeared on their screens. Tropical paradise of Hawaii had lulled the American forces into a false sense of security. The warm trade winds, the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor walls, and the distant sound of sailors calling to one another created an atmosphere of peace that would soon be shattered forever. Neither the highest-ranking officers nor the lowest-ranking enlisted men could have imagined that in just a few hours, this peaceful Sunday morning would transform into what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would later call a date which will live in infamy. As the sun climbed higher in the Hawaiian sky, painting the waters of Pearl Harbor in shades of gold and blue, the stage was set for an attack that would change the course of world history and thrust the United States irrevocably into the Second World War. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning Hawaiian time, the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared off the flight decks of the 6 aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Oahu. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, leading. The aerial assault from his Nakajima B-5 and Kate bomber surveyed the formation spread out behind him. 183 aircraft climbed into the morning sky. 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters. The Japanese pilots had trained for months for this moment, practicing. Their attack runs over models of Pearl Harbor, so detailed that they could identify individual buildings and ships. Each pilot knew his specific target, his approach route, and his escape path. The element of surprise was crucial to their success, and everything depended on maintaining radio silence until the moment of attack. As the massive formation flew south toward Oahu, the Hawaiian radio stations continued their peaceful Sunday morning broadcasts. The sweet melodies of Hawaiian music drifted across the islands, creating an ironic soundtrack to the approaching doom. Many of the Japanese pilots, monitoring American radio frequencies, used these broadcasts to help navigate toward their target. At 7:20 in the morning, the Opana radar station detected something unusual. Private Joseph Lockard noticed a large blip on his radar screen, indicating a formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The reading was unlike anything he had seen before. The signal was so strong that it seemed to indicate a formation of at least 50 aircraft, possibly more. Lockard immediately contacted the information center at Fort Shafter, where Lieutenant Kermit Tyler was serving as the duty officer. When Lockard reported the unusual radar contact, Tyler made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Assuming the aircraft were either a formation of American B-17 flying Fortress bombers expected to arrive from the mainland, or perhaps Navy aircraft returning from maneuvers, Tyler told Lockard not to worry about it. "Don't worry about it," Tyler said, dismissing what would prove to be the most significant radar contact in American military history. As the Japanese formation continued its approach, Commander Fukita could see the outline of Oahu emerging from the morning haze. The island lay peaceful and unsuspecting beneath him, its green mountains and white beaches creating a picture of tropical tranquility. Pearl Harbor itself was clearly visible, and Fukita could make out the distinctive shapes of American battleships, anchored in neat rows along the southern shore of Ford Island. The sight that greeted Fukita exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The American Pacific Fleet lay at anchor exactly as Japanese intelligence had predicted, with no signs of increased alertness or defensive preparations. The battleships were moored in pairs, making them easier targets for torpedo attacks. Protective anti-torpedo nets were visible, and the harbor appeared to be operating under normal peacetime conditions. At 7:49 in the morning, Commander Fukita gave the order that would echo through history. Breaking radio silence for the first time since leaving the Japanese carriers, he transmitted the code words, "Tora! Tora! Tora! Tiger! Tiger! Tiger!" indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The message was immediately relayed back to the Japanese fleet and to Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, where Admiral Yamamoto and his staff waited anxiously for news of the attack's success. The first wave of Japanese aircraft split into their predetermined attack groups. The high-level bombers, led by Fukita himself, began their approach to Battleship Row. The torpedo bombers, flying low over the water, prepared to attack the battleships from the harbor side. The dive bombers targeted the airfields at Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Kaneo Bay, while the Zero fighters swept in to strafe any aircraft they could find on the ground. As noted by the United States Navy's official historical account, World War II came to the United States of America on Sunday morning, the 7th of December 1941, with a massive surprise attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The peaceful morning that had begun with church services and leisurely breakfasts was about to transform into a day of infamy that would reshape the Destiny of nations. The Japanese aircraft descended upon their targets like a storm of steel and fire, their engines screaming through the quiet Hawaiian air. Below them, the American servicemen at Pearl Harbor were about to experience the most devastating surprise attack in United States military history. At 7:55 in the morning, the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The initial targets were the airfields where American aircraft sat lined up wingtip to wingtip in neat rows, making perfect targets for the incoming dive bombers. At Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Kaneo Bay Naval Air Station, explosions erupted across the tarmac as Japanese bombs found their marks with devastating accuracy. Simultaneously, the torpedo bombers of the Imperial Japanese Navy began their deadly runs against Battleship Row, flying at wave-top height. These aircraft approached the massive American warships from the shallow harbor side, where conventional wisdom had always held that torpedo attacks were impossible due to the depth of the water. The Japanese had solved this problem by modifying their torpedoes with wooden fins that allowed them to run in shallow water, a technical innovation that American intelligence had failed to detect. The first torpedo struck the USS Oklahoma at 7:56 in the morning. The massive explosion tore a gaping hole in the battleship's port side, sending tons of seawater cascading into her hull. Within minutes, additional torpedoes found their mark, and the Oklahoma began listing heavily to port as her compartments flooded with alarming speed. Aboard the nearby USS Arizona, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg were among the first to realize the magnitude of the attack. As Japanese aircraft swarmed over the harbor, both officers rushed to their battle stations, but their ship was already doomed. At 8:06 in the morning, a modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell, dropped from a high-level bomber, penetrated the Arizona's forward magazine. The explosion that followed was catastrophic beyond description. The Arizona's forward magazine, containing over 1 million pounds of gunpowder and high explosives, detonated in a fireball that could be seen for miles. The blast lifted the ship's massive forward turrets completely off their mounts and sent a column of smoke and flame nearly a mile into the Hawaiian sky. In that single moment, 1,177 American sailors and Marines perished, representing more than half of all American casualties from the entire Pearl Harbor attack. The USS West Virginia, moored outboard of the Tennessee, became another primary target for Japanese torpedo bombers. Captain Mervyn Benyon was mortally wounded by shrapnel from a nearby bomb blast, but continued to direct his ship's defense until he succumbed to his injuries. The West Virginia took multiple torpedo hits and began settling by the stern, but her crew's damage control efforts prevented her from capsizing like the Oklahoma. As the attack intensified, American servicemen throughout the harbor began responding to the crisis with whatever weapons they could find. Gunner's Mate First Class John Finn, stationed at Kaneo Bay Naval Air Station, manned a machine gun position despite being wounded by strafing fire. His courageous defense of the airfield under continuous enemy attack would later earn him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese pilots found their targets largely defenseless. Most of the American aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could take off, and the few that managed to get airborne faced overwhelming odds. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, two Army Air Forces pilots stationed at Wheeler Field, managed to reach their P-40 Warhawk fighters at nearby Halaiwa Field and successfully engage the Japanese attackers, shooting down several enemy aircraft. At the same time, the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a symbol of American determination. Despite being hit by a torpedo and multiple bombs, her crew managed to slip her moorings and head for the harbor entrance. However, recognizing that a sinking ship in the narrow channel would block the harbor for months, the Nevada's commanding officer deliberately ran her aground near Hospital Point rather than risk blocking the entrance. The surprise was so complete that many American servicemen initially thought they were witnessing a highly realistic training exercise. The sound of aircraft engines and explosions was not uncommon during peacetime maneuvers, and it took several minutes for the reality of the situation to sink in. Sailors who had been enjoying their Sunday morning breakfast found themselves racing to battle stations as their ships shuddered under the impact of bombs and torpedoes. As smoke and flames began rising from ships throughout the harbor, radio operators frantically transmitted messages that would alert the world to the attack. The famous message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill," was broadcast repeatedly, carrying the shocking news across the Pacific to military commanders and government officials on the American mainland. The first wave of the attack lasted approximately 30 minutes. But those 30 minutes had already transformed Pearl Harbor from a peaceful naval base into a scene of devastation and heroism that would be remembered throughout American history. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft completed their devastating attack runs and began withdrawing to the north, the men of Pearl Harbor faced a hellish landscape of burning ships, twisted metal, and billowing smoke. Yet from this chaos emerged countless acts of heroism that would define the American response to the surprise attack. Seaman First Class James Ward, serving aboard the USS Oklahoma, found himself trapped below decks as the massive battleship began capsizing. Water rushed through the torpedo holes in the ship's hull, and the lights went out as electrical systems failed. In the darkness, Ward and his shipmates fought their way through flooded compartments, helping wounded comrades and searching for any possible escape route. Many would not survive, but Ward's efforts to save his fellow sailors exemplified the spirit that would carry America through the coming war. On Ford Island, Chief Petty Officer John Finn continued to man his machine gun position, despite being wounded by shrapnel and strafing fire. As Japanese aircraft swept low over the island, Finn maintained a steady stream of fire, his weapon chattering defiantly against the enemy formation. His unwavering courage under fire would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but on that morning, he was simply doing what he felt was his duty. The hospital ship USS Solace, moored nearby, immediately began taking on casualties from the burning warships. Hospital Corpsman Third Class Robert Bennett organized rescue boats to ferry wounded sailors from the damaged vessels, making trip after trip through the oil-slicked, flame-covered waters. The Solace's medical staff worked tirelessly to treat the flood of casualties, setting up emergency treatment areas on deck when the ship's medical facilities became overwhelmed. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman First Class Donald Stratton found himself trapped on the burning battleship superstructure. The ship's forward magazines had exploded, killing most of the crew forward of the mainmast, but Stratton and several other sailors remained alive in the ship's aft sections. Using a line thrown from the nearby repair ship USS Vestal, Stratton and his fellow survivors made a harrowing hand-over-hand journey across the burning, oil-covered water to safety. The attack also revealed the courage of civilian workers at the naval base. Despite the danger, many civilian employees of the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard rushed to help fight fires and rescue wounded sailors. These men, who had no military training for combat situations, risked their lives alongside the military personnel to help save ships and lives. At 8:54 in the morning, the second wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. This formation consisted of 171 aircraft, 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. However, the element of surprise was now gone, and American defenses were fully alert and fighting back. The second wave concentrated primarily on the naval vessels that had escaped serious damage during the first attack, as well as the naval shipyard facilities. The USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock for maintenance, became a primary target. Despite being hit by several bombs, The battleship's crew managed to keep her afloat and continue fighting. The destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs sharing the same. Dry dock were less fortunate and were severely damaged by direct bomb hits. American anti-aircraft fire had intensified significantly by the time the second wave arrived. Gunners throughout the harbor, now fully alert and supplied with ammunition, sent up a barrage of fire that made the Japanese pilots' task much more difficult. The USS Nevada, despite being run aground, continued to fight back with her anti-aircraft guns, her crew refusing to abandon their posts despite the ship's desperate condition. Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki found his targets much more difficult to approach than the first wave had encountered. American fighters, though few in number, were now airborne and engaging the Japanese formation. The P-40 Warhawks, flown by Lieutenants Welch and Taylor, had been joined by other aircraft that had managed to take off from the surviving airfields, creating a small but determined air defense. The heroism displayed during the second wave was no less remarkable than during the first. Seaman Second Class Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia, helped carry wounded sailors to safety before manning an anti-aircraft gun, despite having no formal training on the weapon. His courage in the face of enemy fire would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African Americans to receive such recognition. As the second wave of attackers began their withdrawal, the full scope of the damage became apparent. The harbor was filled with burning ships, oil-covered water, and the debris of what had been the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Yet the response of the American servicemen and civilians at Pearl Harbor had demonstrated something that the Japanese planners had not anticipated: the resilience and determination of the American people when faced with adversity. The heroes who emerged from the flames of Pearl Harbor would become symbols of American courage and sacrifice, their actions inspiring a nation to rise from the ashes of defeat and forge a path to ultimate victory. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the last Japanese aircraft had disappeared over the northern horizon, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would be seared into American memory forever. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but in that brief time, the Japanese had achieved tactical success beyond their wildest expectations, while simultaneously awakening a sleeping giant that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. Immediate aftermath of the attack revealed the full scope of the catastrophe. In total, 2,404 U.S. military personnel and civilians were killed. 1,177 of those casualties were aboard one ship, the USS Arizona, where an armor-piercing bomb struck and ignited over 1 million pounds of gunpowder within the ship. The Oklahoma had capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors in her hull. The West Virginia had settled to the bottom of the harbor, while the California was slowly sinking at her moorings. Admiral Kimmel, watching the destruction from his headquarters, immediately began assessing the damage and organizing rescue efforts. Despite the devastation, his first priority was determining whether the Japanese might return for a third wave of attacks. Intelligence reports were fragmentary, and no one knew whether this was merely the opening move in a larger invasion of the Hawaiian Islands. The rescue efforts that began immediately after the attack demonstrated the best of American character under extreme adversity. Sailors from undamaged ships volunteered to dive into the oil-covered harbor waters to search for survivors. The repair ship USS Vestal, despite being damaged herself, began taking on wounded sailors from the Arizona. Small boats from throughout the harbor converged on the burning battleships, their crews risking their lives to pull survivors from the water. One of the most dramatic rescue efforts involved the USS Oklahoma. As the massive battleship settled on her side, knocking sounds could be heard from within her hull, indicating that sailors were still alive but trapped in air pockets. Rescue crews worked frantically with cutting torches and other equipment to reach these survivors. Over the next several days, 32 men would be rescued from the Oklahoma's hull, Though many more had already perished in the flooding compartments, the medical response to the attack was equally heroic. The naval hospital at Pearl Harbor was quickly overwhelmed with casualties, and medical personnel worked without rest to treat the wounded. Civilian hospitals throughout Oahu opened their doors to military casualties, and doctors and nurses from across the island volunteered their services. The territory's blood banks were quickly depleted, leading to emergency appeals for blood donations that were answered by hundreds of Hawaiian residents. News of the attack spread rapidly across the American mainland, where it was initially met with disbelief and shock. The first reports reached the East Coast during Sunday afternoon, interrupting football games and weekend activities with bulletin announcements that seemed almost too incredible to believe. Many Americans initially thought they were hearing a radio drama similar to Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds broadcast. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was having lunch at the White House when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox telephoned with the devastating news. Roosevelt's immediate reaction was to convene his cabinet and military advisors to assess the situation and plan America's response. The president, who had been trying to find a way to support Britain and the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, while maintaining American neutrality, now faced the reality that neutrality was no longer an option. The attack had immediate, strategic implications beyond the Hawaiian Islands. Japanese forces, coordinating their assault with the Pearl Harbor attack, simultaneously struck American and British positions throughout the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong all came under attack as Japan launched its coordinated offensive across the Pacific Basin. In Washington, military leaders struggled to assess the full scope of the damage and its implications for America's ability to respond. The Pacific Fleet's battle line had been effectively eliminated, and the aircraft losses at the Hawaiian airfields had significantly reduced American air power in the Pacific. However, the Japanese had failed to achieve several crucial objectives that would prove significant in the long term. Most importantly, the American aircraft carriers had been absent from Pearl Harbor during the attack. The USS Enterprise was returning from a mission to Wake Island, while the USS Lexington was en route to Midway Island. The USS Saratoga was undergoing maintenance on the West Coast. These carriers, along with their air groups, would form the backbone of America's early response to Japanese expansion. The Japanese had also failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, which contained millions of gallons of precious petroleum products. Additionally, the naval shipyard and its dry docks remained largely intact, providing the infrastructure necessary to repair many of the damaged ships and return them to service. The submarine base had also escaped serious damage, allowing America's submarine force to begin operations against Japanese shipping almost immediately. As night fell over Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the United States stood at a crossroads. The attack had been a tactical victory for Japan, but it had also provided America with something that all of President Roosevelt's speeches and diplomatic efforts had failed to achieve: national unity and determination to fight. The dawn of December 8, 1941, broke over a changed America. Across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico, the American people awakened to a new reality. The isolationist sentiment that had dominated American politics for more than 2 decades had been shattered in the space of 2 hours over a harbor in Hawaii. In Washington, President Roosevelt worked through the night with his speechwriters, crafting the address he would deliver to Congress the following day. The president understood that this moment would define not only his presidency, but the entire future of American civilization. His words would need to unite a nation, explain the gravity of the situation, and prepare the American people for the long struggle that lay ahead. The casualties from Pearl Harbor continued to mount as rescue workers pulled bodies from the harbor and the damaged ships. The USS Arizona, still burning and sending columns of smoke into the Hawaiian sky, had become a tomb for over 1,100 American sailors and Marines. The Oklahoma, lying on her side like a beached whale, would yield more bodies as salvage crews worked to right the massive vessel. News of the attack spread across the Pacific as radio operators at Pearl Harbor maintained contact with American forces throughout the region. The reports they received painted a picture of coordinated Japanese aggression on a scale that few military planners had thought possible. The Philippines were under attack, with Japanese aircraft bombing Clark Field and other military installations. Guam had fallen to Japanese invasion forces. Wake Island was under siege. On the American mainland, the reaction was swift and decisive. Young men lined up at military recruiting stations, many of which had to remain open throughout the night to handle the flood of volunteers. The attack had achieved something that months of political debate had failed to accomplish. It had united the American people in a common cause. Regional differences, political affiliations, and social divisions seemed to evaporate in the face of this external threat. The industrial capacity of the United States, still recovering from the Great Depression, began to mobilize for war production. Factory owners received urgent calls from government officials, asking them to assess how quickly they could convert their production lines to manufacture military equipment. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt would later call it, was beginning to stir. In Pearl Harbor, the immediate priority remained rescue and damage assessment. Admiral Kimmel, despite the devastating blow to his fleet, was already planning how to strike back with the forces that remained. The submarine base had escaped serious damage, and America's submarine fleet began preparing for offensive operations against Japanese shipping. The surviving cruisers and destroyers were organized into task forces that could begin harassing Japanese operations in the Central Pacific. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign enemies had successfully attacked American territory and killed American civilians. The myth of American invulnerability, protected by two vast oceans, had been shattered. The Japanese had demonstrated that modern technology could bridge any geographic barrier, bringing warfare directly to American soil. However, the attack also revealed something about the American character that would prove crucial in the coming war. The response of the servicemen at Pearl Harbor, from the highest-ranking officers to the lowest-ranking enlisted men, had been one of courage and determination rather than panic and despair. Men who had never expected to face combat had risen to the challenge, manning their guns, fighting fires, and rescuing their comrades without regard for their personal safety. The civilian population of Hawaii had also responded magnificently to the crisis. Despite the shock and terror of the attack, Hawaiian civilians had volunteered to help with rescue efforts, donated blood for the wounded, and opened their homes to servicemen who had lost their quarters in the bombing. The multi-ethnic population of the territory, including Americans of Japanese ancestry, had demonstrated their loyalty to the United States in the face of suspicion and fear. As news of the attack spread around the world, reactions varied dramatically. In Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler was reportedly delighted by the news, believing that Japanese aggression would keep America focused on the Pacific rather than Europe. In London, Winston Churchill was said to have felt a mixture of horror at the attack and relief that America would finally enter the war. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin recognized that the attack would provide relief for the Soviet Union by forcing Japan to focus on the Pacific rather than opening a second front in Siberia. The Japanese leadership, monitoring American radio broadcasts and news reports, began to realize that their attack might have had consequences they had not anticipated. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had reportedly warned his superiors that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months to a year. But after that, he had no confidence in Japanese success. The American reaction to Pearl Harbor suggested that Yamamoto's timeline might prove to be optimistic. As the sun set on December 8th, America prepared for war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ended the American Age of Innocence, but it had also awakened the industrial and military potential of the world's largest democracy. The sleeping giant was beginning to stir, and the world would never be the same. December 8, 1941, would be remembered as the day America officially entered World War II. At 12:30 in the afternoon, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress to deliver what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. The House chamber was packed with senators, representatives, Supreme Court justices, and cabinet members, all waiting to hear how their nation would respond to the previous day's attack. Roosevelt's voice, carried by radio waves across the continent and around the world, was steady and resolute as he began his address. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The president's words crystallized the national mood, transforming shock and grief into determination and resolve. The speech was brief but powerful, lasting only 6 minutes and 30 seconds. Roosevelt detailed the coordinated nature of the Japanese attacks across the Pacific, emphasizing that the assault on Pearl Harbor was part of a larger pattern of aggression. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area, he declared. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. The President's conclusion was simple and direct. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Senate voted unanimously for war, while the House of Representatives approved the declaration by a vote of 388 to 1, with only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana dissenting. Back in Pearl Harbor, the work of rescue and recovery continued. The harbor remained a scene of devastation, with the Arizona still burning and the Oklahoma lying on her side like a wounded giant. Salvage crews worked around the clock to rescue survivors trapped in the hulls of the damaged ships and to assess which vessels might be saved. The California was slowly sinking at her moorings, while the West Virginia had settled to the bottom of the harbor. The Japanese had achieved their immediate tactical objectives, but the strategic implications of their attack were already becoming apparent. The American people, who had been deeply divided about involvement in the war, were now united in their determination to defeat Japan. The attack had provided the Roosevelt administration with something it had desperately needed: a clear and compelling reason for America to enter the global conflict. However, the Japanese had also made several critical errors that would prove costly in the long term. The attack had focused primarily on the battleships, which represented the previous generation of naval warfare. The aircraft carriers, which would prove to be the decisive weapons of the Pacific War, had been absent from Pearl Harbor and remained intact. The submarine base had escaped serious damage, allowing America's submarine force to begin operations against Japanese shipping immediately. Perhaps most importantly, the Japanese had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's infrastructure. The fuel storage facilities, containing millions of gallons of petroleum products essential for fleet operations, remained intact. The naval shipyard and its dry docks were largely undamaged, providing the capacity to repair many of the damaged ships and return them to service. The machine shops, foundries, and other industrial facilities that would be essential for American naval power in the Pacific had survived the attack, The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the Hawaiian Islands. The attack had shattered American assumptions about geographic security and demonstrated that modern warfare could strike anywhere without warning. However, it had also revealed the resilience and courage of the American people when faced with adversity. The heroic actions of the servicemen at Pearl Harbor, from Admiral Kidd and Captain Van Valkenburg, who died at their posts on the Arizona, to the countless sailors and soldiers who fought back against overwhelming odds, had provided the nation with heroes and inspiration. The civilian response to the attack was equally remarkable. Americans from all walks of life volunteered for military service, purchased war bonds, donated blood, and transformed their lives to support the war effort. The industrial capacity of the United States, still emerging from the Great Depression, began the most remarkable military production program in human history. Factories that had been producing automobiles and consumer goods retooled to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and ships. The attack on Pearl Harbor had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. It marked the end of American isolationism and the beginning of America's emergence as a global superpower. The Japanese had sought to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific, but instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. In the words of Admiral Yamamoto himself, the attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The events of December 7, 1941, would indeed live in infamy, but they would also live as a testament to American courage, resilience, and determination in the face of adversity. The day that began with such devastating surprise had ended with a united nation committed to victory, setting the stage for America's eventual triumph in the Pacific War. The attack on Pearl Harbor had changed America forever, transforming it from a reluctant observer of global conflict into the leader of the Allied cause. The unforgettable day that brought such death and destruction had also brought forth the strength and character that would carry America through its greatest trial and emerge victorious in the greatest conflict in human history.